When my husband barked that his son wasn't mine to discipline, he forgot who paid for the boy's life. I'm Thea Finch, 52, a commercial loan officer. He thought he was putting me in my place. He didn't realize he was cutting his son's lifeline. Watch how fast a golden boy's world dries up. The dining room of my home in Canton, Ohio, still smelled of the pot roast I'd spent 4 hours slow cooking after a 60-hour workweek. I had bought this house 12 years before I ever met Richard. It wasn't a mansion, but it was solid, red brick, with a wraparound porch and a mortgage I'd personally paid down to the very last penny. On the table sat my mother's old ceramic gravy boat, chipped at the lip, a humble piece of utility that had survived 3 moves and a divorce. I loved that gravy boat. It reminded me of where I came from, a family of machinists and grocery clerks who believed that if you didn't earn it, you didn't own it. But Richard and his 19-year-old son, Hunter, didn't understand that kind of math. Sitting across from me was my daughter Chloe. She's 22, a preschool teacher who spends her days wiping runny noses and teaching toddlers how to share. She lives in a tiny, drafty apartment and drives a 10-year-old compact car with a dented fender. Chloe had saved up her own money to buy a nice bottle of wine for this family dinner, wanting to celebrate her first parent-teacher conference week being over. She had a quiet, tired smile on her face, her hands wrapped around her glass, just happy to be home for a Sunday meal. And then there was Hunter. Hunter sat at the end of the table, his eyes glued to his smartphone, his thumbs flying across the screen. He was wearing a designer fleece pullover that cost more than Chloe's weekly grocery budget. On his wrist was a smartwatch he'd begged for last Christmas, and parked in the driveway was a sleek, midnight black sedan with custom rims, a car that I had co-signed for and made the down payment on under the guise of helping him get to his sophomore classes safely. "Hunter," Richard said, his voice dripping with indulgent pride. "Put the phone down for 5 minutes, buddy. Your Aunt Beatrice is trying to tell us about her trip to Sedona." Beatrice, Richard's older sister, waved a hand adorned with turquoise rings. "Oh, let the boy be, Richard. He's young. He's popular. Unlike some people, he actually has a social life to maintain." She cast a pointed, patronizing look at Chloe, who swallowed hard and stared down at her plate. Beatrice had never liked me, mostly because I didn't fit into the high society mold she pretended to belong to. Beatrice lived off a dwindling trust fund left by her grandfather, while I spent my days analyzing balance sheets and assessing risk for small businesses. To her, I was just a glorified bank teller. To her, my daughter Chloe was just a daycare worker. Hunter didn't put the phone down. He snorted, his eyes still on the screen. "Yeah, well, my social life actually matters. I'm not trying to spend my Sunday night listening to stories about rocks and vortexes. And I definitely don't want to look at whatever cheap sweater Chloe dragged out of a thrift store bin." The table went dead silent. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen suddenly sounded deafening. Chloe's cheeks flushed a deep, painful crimson. She pulled the sleeves of her faded gray cardigan down over her wrists, trying to make herself smaller. It was a sweater I'd bought her 3 years ago when she was struggling to pay for her textbooks. It was clean, neat, and soft, but to Hunter, it was a target. I felt a cold, familiar knot tighten in my chest. If you've ever sat at your own table, a table you bought with your own sweat and tears, and watched someone you feed spit on your child, you know exactly what that knot feels like. You know the exact moment the warmth drains out of your blood and is replaced by something hard, heavy, and absolutely final. "Hunter," I said, my voice quiet, measured, and perfectly level. I didn't raise my voice. In my line of work, the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the worst credit. "You will apologize to Chloe right now. And you will put that phone in your pocket, or you can leave this table." Hunter didn't even look up at me. He just rolled his eyes, a slow, theatrical gesture of pure contempt. "Whatever, Thea, it's not that deep. She looks like a charity case. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." "Hunter," Chloe whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I didn't do anything to you." "That is enough," I said, placing my palms flat on the table. The wood felt cool against my skin. "Richard, your son is guest in my home, and he is speaking to my daughter with utter disrespect. Address him or I will." Richard paused, his fork hovering over his plate. He looked at me, then at Hunter, and then at his sister Beatrice, who gave a soft, mocking chuckle. "Oh please, Thea," Beatrice scoffed, resting her chin on her hand. "Don't be so dramatic. He's 19, he's a boy. You're always so sensitive about these things." Maybe if Chloe dressed a little better, she wouldn't feel so insecure. Beatrice, keep your mouth shut, I said, not breaking eye contact with my husband. Richard, I'm waiting. Richard sighed, a heavy, irritated sound, as if I were the one causing a scene. He laid his fork down with a deliberate clatter. He looked at me, not with love, not even with partner-like respect, but with a cold, dismissive arrogance that made my stomach turn. He had married me 3 years ago, a year after his consulting business began to flounder. He had moved into my house, accepted my help with his debts, and quietly let me shoulder the burden of his lifestyle while keeping up the appearance of being the successful patriarch. Thea, sit down and eat your dinner, Richard said, his voice loud enough to echo in the dining room. He's 19. He's not your son. Don't correct him. I stared at him. What did you just say? Richard leaned forward, his face hardening. He wanted to make sure everyone at the table heard him. He wanted to make sure Beatrice saw him assert his dominance, and he wanted to make sure Hunter knew he was protected. I said, he is my son, not yours, Richard repeated, each word dripping with condescension. You have no right to discipline him, and you certainly don't have the authority to tell him what to do in front of my family. You're his stepmother, Thea. Know your lane. Don't correct him. Hunter let out a small, triumphant smirk, looking up from his phone to watch my humiliation. Beatrice took a slow sip of her wine, a smug grin playing on her lips. Beside me, Chloe looked absolutely devastated. She looked at me, her eyes pleading with me to let it go, to not start a fight, to just let her escape back to her quiet, lonely apartment where no one could hurt her. She was used to taking the blows. I had raised her to be gentle, but in this moment, I realized I had also raised her to be too patient with people who didn't deserve her grace. I looked at Richard. I looked at the man whose credit score I had personally pulled out of the gutter, whose car insurance I paid, whose health insurance was currently tied to my bank's executive plan. I looked at the man who hadn't contributed a single dollar to the household account in 6 months because of cash flow issues in his mythical consulting firm. I felt the heavy cast-iron weight of my grandfather's notary embosser sitting on the desk in my home office just down the hall. It was a tool of validation, of making things official and permanent. It was a reminder of who I was, a woman of documents, of fine print, of cold, hard facts. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my napkin down. I didn't cry. Instead, I let a small, polite smile touch my lips. The kind of smile I give to a client when I'm about to deny their loan application because their debt-to-income ratio is a complete disaster. Fine, I said softly. Richard blinked, slightly taken aback by how icily I had folded. Good. Now let's get back to Beatrice's trip. Yes, let's, I murmured. I reached over and gently patted Chloe's hand under the table. Her fingers were trembling, but I squeezed them tight, sending her a silent message. Asterisk, hold on, baby girl. Just hold on. Asterisk. I sat through the rest of the dinner in complete silence, listening to Beatrice brag about her spiritual awakening, listening to Richard laugh at Hunter's stupid, expensive jokes, and watching Hunter texts under the table. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully drawn the line between us and her. They thought they had reminded the working-class girl from Canton where she belonged. They had no idea that when you draw a line in the sand, you have to make sure you're standing on the side that actually owns the beach. After dinner, Chloe quickly gathered her things. I should get going, Mom. I have to grade some vocabulary sheets tonight. I'll walk you out, sweetie, I said. On the porch, the cool autumn air hit my face, clearing away the suffocating warmth of the dining room. Chloe looked at me, her eyes filled with worry. Mom, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have come. I always mess up the dynamic. Don't you ever say that, I said, grabbing her by the shoulders and looking her dead in the eyes. You didn't do anything wrong. You are a beautiful, hard-working, decent human being, and I am so incredibly proud of you. Do you hear me? She nodded, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. I just hate how they treat you. Richard has no right to speak to you like that. Not in your own house. He won't do it again, I whispered, kissing her forehead. Go home, get some sleep. I love you. I watched her drive away, her little compact car sputtering slightly as it turned the corner. I stood on that porch for a long time, watching the exhaust vanish into the night air. When I finally went back inside, the house was quiet. Richard was in the den with a glass of scotch, watching a game. Hunter's bedroom door was closed, the bass from his video games vibrating through the drywall. I walked down the hall to my home office. I sat down at my desk, turned on the small brass banker's lamp, and opened my laptop. I opened my personal banking portal. The one Richard didn't have access to because he hated dealing with numbers. I looked at the primary checking account. I looked at the joint household account, which was funded entirely by my monthly transfers from my salary. Then, I looked at the auxiliary accounts. I looked at the automatic draft for the lease on a 2023 black sedan. I looked at the recurring monthly allowance transfer of $1,500 to Hunter's student checking account, labeled living expenses. I looked at the pending tuition payment for the upcoming spring semester at the private four-year university. Hunter attended a payment of $14,800, scheduled to be auto-debited from my personal high-yield savings account in exactly 4 days. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my heavy, green enameled desktop embosser. I ran my thumb over the cold steel of the seal. Asterisk, he's not your son, Thea. Don't correct him. Asterisk. I smiled again, the silence of the room wrapping around me like a warm coat. You're absolutely right, Richard, I whispered to the empty room. He isn't my son. With a few swift, precise clicks of my mouse, I began to redraft the terms of our family's economy. The green enameled desktop embosser sat on the corner of my desk, catching the faint amber glow of my brass banker's lamp. It belonged to my grandfather, a man who spent 40 years as a notary public in a small steel town. He used to tell me that a person's word is only as good as the paper they're willing to sign. In my world, as a commercial loan officer, that truth is my daily bread. We don't deal in promises at the bank. We deal in signatures, collateral, and binding terms. I pulled my laptop closer, the screen casting a pale, bluish light over my face. The house was dead quiet now, save for the low, rhythmic rumble of the furnace kicking on in the basement. Down the hall, Richard was fast asleep, probably dreaming of the phantom business deals he'd been chasing for the last 3 years. In the next room, Hunter's video games had finally gone silent. They were sleeping the deep, unbothered sleep of people who believe their safety net is permanent. If you've ever sat in the dark of your own home, listening to the people you feed sleep peacefully while you map out how to save your own life, you know that the silence isn't empty, it's heavy. It's full of the choices you should have made a long time ago. I logged into the online student billing portal for Malone University. There it was, sitting in bold, black letters, asterisk spring semester tuition. Balance due, $14,800 underneath. The payment method was listed as autodraft, linked directly to my personal high-yield savings account. The money I had inherited from my mother and spent a decade adding to, dollar by dollar, from my own salary. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I felt a sudden, sharp pinch in my chest, a fleeting wave of guilt. I was raised to be a builder, not a destroyer. I had spent my whole life trying to make things easier for the people around me, often at my own expense. But then I saw my daughter Chloe's face in my mind, flushing a painful red at the dinner table, while Hunter mocked her thrift store sweater. I remembered Richard's voice, cold and sharp. Asterisk, he's not your son. Don't correct him. Asterisk, the guilt vanished, replaced by a cool, clean certainty. I clicked Edit Payment Method. I deleted my routing number. I deleted my account number. Then, I clicked on the third-party payer agreement form. I filled in my name, Hunter's student ID number, and typed a short, precise message in the comments box. Asterisk effective immediately. Thea Finch hereby revokes all financial responsibility for student Hunter Finch. Please direct all future invoices and billing statements to the primary student account holder and his father, Richard Finch. Asterisk. I clicked Submit. The screen blinked, and a green checkmark appeared. Asterisk changes saved. Asterisk. That was step 1. Next, I opened my personal checking account. I scrolled down to the recurring monthly transfers. There it was. Asterisk transfer to Hunter Finch student checking $1,500. Scheduled for the first of every month. Asterisk it was labeled living expenses. I knew what those living expenses were: designer sneakers, bar tabs, and expensive dinners he used to impress his friends. I clicked cancel recurring transfer. 1 click. 2 clicks. Done. I didn't stop there. I opened my credit card portal. Richard had a secondary card on my account. A card I had given him for emergencies when his consulting business first started drydocking. I looked at the recent pending transactions. $120 at a boutique wine shop. $85 at a steakhouse. None of these were emergencies. I selected his card number and clicked Deactivate Card. When the system asked for a reason, I chose cardholder, no longer authorized. My hand was steady as I shut the laptop. but my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculating. I stood up, walked to my filing cabinet, and pulled out a faded manila folder labeled Asterisk 2023 Sedan. Asterisk, I sat back down under the brass lamp and opened the folder. Inside was the retail installment sale contract for the midnight black sedan parked in my driveway. I scanned the lines of fine print, my eyes darting to the section labeled Buyer and Co-Buy. Because Hunter had absolutely no credit history and Richard's credit score was hovering in the ND 500s due to unpaid tax liens, the dealership wouldn't let either of them touch the car without me. I had signed as the primary buyer. The loan was in my name. The title, registered with the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles, read, Asterisk Thea Finch, O.R. Hunter Finch, Asterisk. In the state of Ohio, that O.R. is a very powerful word. It meant either party had the legal right to sell, transfer, or take sole possession of the vehicle without the other's signature. And since the monthly loan payments of $680 were auto-debited from my personal account, I was the one who had actually paid for every single mile that car had driven. I took out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. At 6:30 the next morning, I was sitting in a corner booth at the Golden Coin Diner on the edge of town. The air inside smelled of burnt toast, cheap chicory coffee, and floor wax. It was the kind of place where the linoleum was worn down to the gray backing in front of the cash register, and the waitresses called you honey without meaning anything by it. It was my kind of place. Sitting across from me was Sarah, my closest friend and a senior escrow officer at the county title company. Sarah and I had worked together for 15 years. She had seen me through my first divorce, through the lean years when I was raising Chloe on peanut butter and budget spreadsheets, and she had been the only one who warned me about marrying Richard. You look like you haven't slept a wink, Thea, Sarah said, wrapping her hands around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. I pushed the manila folder across the sticky laminate table. I haven't. I need you to look at these registration and title docs. I want to make sure I'm not missing a single comma. Sarah pulled her reading glasses down from her head and opened the folder. She read in silence for a few minutes, her brow furrowing, then a slow, cautious smile began to spread across her face. You're finally doing it. I am, I said, taking a sip of my coffee. It was hot and bitter, but it woke me up. Richard told me last night that Hunter isn't my son. He told me to know my lane and stop correcting him. So, I'm staying in my lane. My lane just happens to be the one that owns everything they use to breathe. Sarah let out a soft, low whistle. Well, legally speaking, you're completely in the clear on the vehicle. The OR on the Ohio title means you can sign the title over to a dealership, sell it, or simply take the keys back. You don't need Hunter's permission, and you certainly don't need Richard's. But what about the house? She tapped the table with her fingernail. Richard has been living there for 3 years. Has he tried to claim any equity? The house was paid off 12 years before I met him, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, hard whisper. I've kept the property taxes and home insurance strictly in my name, paid from my separate personal account. He's never contributed a single dollar to the maintenance. I have every bank statement from the last 3 years printed and logged in my office. He hasn't even bought a light bulb for that place. Good, Sarah said, closing the folder and handing it back to me. Her eyes were shiny with a mixture of concern and fierce pride. Because when men like Richard realize the well has run dry, they don't just get thirsty. They get nasty. They will try to tear down the well house just so you can't have the water either. You need to be prepared for the fallout. I am, I said. I've spent 25 years assessing risk for a living. Sarah, I know exactly what happens when a bad debtor realizes their collateral is being seized. After I left the diner, I didn't go straight to the bank. Instead, I drove down to an industrial park near the railroad tracks. The gravel lot was surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A sign on the gate read, Asterisk Miller's Recovery and Towing. Asterisk. I parked my car and walked into the small, drafty office. The smell of diesel fuel and wet dog hung heavy in the air. Behind the counter was Vince, a massive man with grease-stained hands and a faded gray sweatshirt. Vince had been a client of mine at the bank for 6 years. When his business was on the verge of bankruptcy during the economic downturn, I had spent 3 weeks reworking his commercial loan package, personally presenting it to the risk committee to ensure he got the line of credit he needed to stay afloat. He had never forgotten it. Thea, Vince boomed, his face lighting up. What brings the best loan officer in Canton down to my neck of the woods so early? I need a favor, Vince, I said, leaning against the counter. A legal, professional favor. And I need it done quietly. Vince's smile faded, replaced by a serious, attentive look. He leaned forward. You name it, Thea, if it's within my power, it's done. I pulled out the spare set of keys to the black Sedantha set I had kept in my kitchen drawer just in case and laid them on the counter alongside. A copy of the car's title and my driver's license. I need you to recover this vehicle, I said. It's currently parked in my driveway. The primary owner on the title is me. I want it towed to your secure lot, and I want it done by 8 o'clock this morning. Vince looked at the keys, then at the title documents, and then up at me. He didn't ask any personal questions. He didn't need to. He knew my character, and he knew I wouldn't be standing in his office at 7 in the morning if things hadn't crossed a very serious line. 8 o'clock, Vince said, his voice deep and steady. He picked up the keys and nodded. We'll have a flatbed there at exactly 7:55. By the time the neighbors are pouring their first cup of coffee, that car will be behind my locked gate. Nobody's touching it but you. Thank you, Vince, I said, feeling a sudden, immense weight lift off my shoulders. Don't mention it, Thea, he replied, giving me a reassuring wink. Just doing my job. I walked out of the tow yard and got back into my car. The morning sun was just starting to break through the gray Ohio clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the gravel. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The pieces were all in place. The tuition was gone. The allowance was gone. The credit card was dead. And in less than an hour, the Golden Boy's wheels would be gone, too. I put my car in gear and drove toward the bank, ready for the storm I knew was coming. The lobby of Canton Savings and Trust always smelled of stale carpet cleaner and damp umbrellas on rainy autumn mornings. I sat at my desk, my fingers resting lightly on the keyboard, watching the cursor blink. To my left was a small, chipped ceramic coaster with a crooked yellow daisy painted on it, a Mother's Day gift Chloe had made for me in the 3rd grade. It was cheap, imperfect, and worth more to me than every single piece of designer clothing currently hanging in Hunter's closet. I was reviewing a loan application for a local family-owned bakery. The owner, a woman named Clara, who had spent 30 years baking bread to send her kids to state college, had a balance sheet that was neat, honest, and tight. Every penny was accounted for. There were no shortcuts in Clara's life, just honest sweat and careful planning. I liked her, I understood her. At exactly 8:02 a.m., my phone began to vibrate against the polished laminate of my desk. The screen lit up with Richard's name. I didn't answer. I simply flipped the phone face down, letting the silent vibration hum against the wood like an angry hornet. If you've ever had to sit at your workplace, pretending to analyze interest rates and collateral while your personal life is quietly detonating in your pocket, you know the exact rhythm of that survival mode. You breathe in through your nose, out through your mouth, and you keep your eyes on the numbers. The numbers don't lie, and they don't yell at you when they don't get their way. 3 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from Richard. Thea, where are you? Hunter's car is gone. It's not in the driveway. He was supposed to drive to his 8:30 class. Did you move it? I didn't reply. I clicked through to the next page of Clara's bakery tax returns, at 8:15 a.m. Another text, this one more frantic. Thea, answer your phone. We think Hunter's car was stolen. The keys are gone from the kitchen counter. I'm calling the police. I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair, took a slow sip of my lukewarm coffee, and finally picked up the phone. I dialed Richard's number. He answered on the very first ring, his voice tight with panic and a rising, defensive anger. Thea, where the hell have you been? I've been calling you for 10 minutes. Hunter's car is gone. Some scumbag must have walked right onto our property last night and taken it. Hunter is losing his mind. He has a midterm review today. Good morning, Richard, I said, my voice as smooth and even as if I were explaining a fixed-rate mortgage to a first-time homebuyer. You don't need to call the police. The car wasn't stolen. A heavy silence fell over the line, broken only by the sound of Richard's heavy, agitated breathing. What do you mean it wasn't stolen? Then where is it? I had it legally recovered, I said. It's currently sitting behind a locked chain-link fence at Miller's Recovery and Towing. The spare keys are in my purse, and the primary keys are with the tow operator. What? Richard's voice cracked, dropping an octave into pure bewilderment. Are you insane? Why would you do that? That's Hunter's car. No, Richard, I said, leaning forward and resting my elbow on Chloe's Daisy coaster. It's my car. The loan is in my name, the down payment came from my personal savings, and the title is registered to me. Since I am the primary owner and the one paying the monthly draft, I decided to take possession of my asset. You can't do that, he shouted, and I could hear the faint, high-pitched whining of Hunter in the background, demanding to know what was happening. We have an agreement, Thea. We got that car so he could get to campus. We had an agreement when I thought we were a family, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. But last night, you made it very clear where the boundaries are. You told me to know my lane. You told me that Hunter is not my son, and that I have no authority over him. I took your words to heart, Richard. I realized I was overstepping. Since he isn't my son, I have absolutely no obligation to provide him with a $30,000 vehicle, insurance, or maintenance. I am simply staying in my lane, just like you asked. Thea, this is ridiculous. Richard hissed, trying to lower his voice so Hunter wouldn't hear the desperation creeping in. You're throwing a tantrum because of a little dinner table argument? He's a kid. He made a stupid comment, and you're going to ruin his semester over it. It wasn't a tantrum, Richard. It was an assessment of risk, I said. And as a commercial loan officer, I've decided that the return on this particular investment is absolute zero. Oh, and by the way, you might want to tell Hunter to check his student portal. What did you do? Richard's voice was barely a whisper now, cold and sharp. I revoked the third-party payer agreement with Malone University, I said. The spring tuition payment of $14,800 will not be drafted from my account this Friday. I suggest you log in and input your own routing number before the registrar drops him from his classes. You can't do this to him, Richard stuttered, the sheer scale of the financial cliff he was standing on finally starting to register. I don't have that kind of money in my business account right now, Thea. You know that. My cash flow is tight. If he gets dropped, he loses his whole year. Then I suggest you call your sister Beatrice, I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. She seemed very concerned about Chloe's thrift store sweater last night. Surely a woman of her high social standing and family pride can write a check for $15,000 to keep her beloved nephew in school. Or perhaps you can take out a personal loan. I can send you the application, though with your current credit score, the interest rate will be quite steep. Thea, please, Richard pleaded, his arrogance completely evaporating, replaced by the frantic bargaining of a man who had lived off someone else's labor for far too long. Let's talk about this tonight. Let me come down to the bank. We can work this out. Hunter will apologize to Chloe. I'll make him do it. No thank you, I said. A forced apology has no value. It's like a bad check. It looks nice on paper, but it bounces the second you try to cash it. I have a meeting with the branch manager in 5 minutes, Richard, I have to go. Thea, wait, what about his allowance? He went to get gas this morning and his student card was declined. He couldn't even buy a bagel. He's 19, Richard. He's a young, popular boy with a very active social life, I said, echoing Beatrice's words from the night before. I'm sure he can find a way to earn some gas money. Maybe he can find a nice thrift store to sell some of those designer pullovers. Have a great day. I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking slightly, a physical reaction to the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and placed it in my desk drawer. I took a deep, shaky breath, looking at Chloe's little ceramic coaster. Asterisk, I did it. Asterisk, I thought. Asterisk, I actually did it. Asterisk. For 3 years, I had allowed myself to be eroded, piece by piece, by a man who married me for my stability and a stepson who treated me like an ATM with a kitchen. I had stayed quiet because I wanted to keep the peace. I had stayed quiet because I didn't want to admit to myself that I had made a terrible mistake in marrying Richard. But watching them target Chloe, my sweet, hardworking girl, who had never asked for a single handout in her life, that was the line. You can walk all over me, but the moment you try to step on my child to make yourself feel taller, the piece is officially over. The rest of the workday passed in a blur of spreadsheets, loan agreements, and customer consultations. Every time I felt a pang of worry or a whisper of guilt, I forced myself to picture Chloe pulling her faded cardigan over her wrists at my dining table, trying to disappear. That image was my shield. It kept me focused, professional, and absolutely unyielding. At noon, I took a short break and walked down to the break room to heat up my lunch. My phone, which I had retrieved from my drawer, was filled with missed calls and messages. There were 6 voicemails from Richard, ranging from furious demands to pathetic pleading. There were 2 texts from Beatrice, calling me petty, unhinged, and a bitter, classless woman who was trying to ruin a young man's future. I smiled as I read Beatrice's texts. I didn't reply. I simply took a screenshot of them and saved them to a secure folder on my cloud drive, right alongside the bank statements showing every mortgage payment I had made on my house since 2011. Then, there was a single text from Chloe. Asterisk, "Hey mom, just wanted to say thank you for dinner last night. I'm sorry it got weird. I love you so much, and I'm so lucky to have you as my mom. Hope you're having a good day at the bank." Asterisk. I felt a hot tear prick the corner of my eye. I quickly wiped it away with the back of my hand, my heart swelling with a fierce, protective warmth. I typed back, asterisk, "I love you more than life itself, baby girl. Everything is going to be just fine. Focus on your kids today." Asterisk, when my shift ended at 5 o'clock, I walked out to my car. The autumn wind was biting, carrying the scent of wet leaves and incoming rain. I drove home slowly, watching the streetlights flicker on along the avenue. I knew what was waiting for me. I knew the storm had gathered in my living room, and that Richard and Hunter and likely Beatrice would be waiting to tear into me the moment I walked through the door. But as I pulled my car into my driveway and looked at the empty space where the black sedan used to park, I didn't feel afraid. I felt a deep, profound sense of calm. I turned off the engine, reached into my passenger seat, and picked up my heavy leather briefcase containing every document, every title, every bank statement, and every contract I had meticulously organized. I was ready to face the music, and for the first time in 3 years, I was the one holding the conductor's baton. The gravel of my driveway crunching under my tires was the only sound in the damp, quiet evening. I turned off the headlights, but I didn't get out of the car right away. I sat there in the dark, watching the warm yellow light spilling from my living room windows onto the wet grass. Under normal circumstances, that light would have felt welcoming. It would have promised warmth, a hot meal, and the comfort of home. But tonight, that light felt like a stage flare, illuminating the arena where I was about to fight for my dignity. I looked down at the passenger seat. My heavy brown leather briefcase sat there, solid and unyielding. Inside it was the paper trail of my life and theirs. I took a deep, steadying breath, grabbed the handle of the briefcase, and stepped out into the biting October air. When I pushed the front door open, the heavy scent of lavender-scented furniture polish and expensive cologne hit me. It was a strange, suffocating mix. The house wasn't quiet. I could hear the sharp, agitated murmur of voices coming from the kitchen. As my boots clicked on the hardwood entryway, the voices abruptly cut off. I walked into the kitchen, my briefcase in hand. They were all there, gathered around my mother's oak kitchen table like a tribunal. Richard was pacing back and forth near the refrigerator, a glass of amber liquid in his hand that I knew wasn't apple juice. Hunter was slumped in one of the chairs, his face pale and furious, staring at his phone as if hoping it would suddenly tell him this was all a bad dream. And to my complete lack of surprise, Beatrice was sitting at the head of the table. Her designer handbag perched on the chair next to her like a chaperone, her fingers wrapped around a mug of tea. The moment I stepped into the room, Richard stopped pacing. His face was flushed, his tie loosened, his eyes wide with a mixture of anger and panic. "Where have you been, Thea?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing off the ceramic tile of the backsplash. "Do you have any idea what kind of day we've had? Hunter had to miss his midterm review because his car was literally stolen from our driveway by some thugs you hired." "It wasn't stolen, Richard. I told you that on the phone," I said, my voice calm, flat, and perfectly level. I walked over to the counter and set my briefcase down with a soft, heavy thud. I didn't rush. I took my time hanging my coat on the back of the pantry door. It was recovered by a licensed repossession agent, my friend Vince. Actually, he was very professional about it. "This is insane," Hunter burst out, slamming his phone onto the table. His voice cracked, the entitled facade cracking with it. "You can't just take my car, Thea. I have practice tomorrow. I have a life. All my gear is in the trunk." My friends saw the tow truck. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was? I turned slowly to look at him. I looked at his expensive fleece pullover, the smartwatch on his wrist, the sneer on his lips that was rapidly melting into childish desperation. "I'm sure it was very embarrassing, Hunter," I said softly. "But as your father so clearly pointed out last night, you are not my son. And since you aren't my son, Your embarrassment, your soccer practice, and your social life are no longer my concern. If you want your gear back, Vince said you can pick it up at the tow yard during regular business hours. You'll just need to pay the $75 storage fee. Cash only. Thea, stop this petty nonsense right now. Beatrice chimed in, her voice dripping with aristocrat of Thesiperb's condescension. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on my mother's table. You are behaving like a spoiled child. To disrupt this boy's education and take away his transportation over a minor disagreement at Sunday dinner is absolutely monstrous. You should be ashamed of yourself. I looked at Beatrice. This was a woman who hadn't worked a single day in her life, who lived off a grandfather's legacy while looking down on the very people who kept her world spinning. Beatrice, I said, walking over to the table and pulling out a chair. If you've ever had to stand your ground against a room full of people who thought you were their personal doormat, you know the quiet power of a piece of paper. You think I'm being petty. You think this is a tantrum. Let me show you what a tantrum looks like in the banking world. I unlatched my briefcase. The metallic snap echoed in the quiet kitchen. I reached inside and pulled out a stack of neatly organized documents, bound by heavy steel paper clips. I laid them on the table, right in front of Richard. Let's look at the numbers, shall we? I said, tapping the first document. This is the current statement for the joint household checking account. As you can see, the balance is currently $42.16. For the last 6 months, the only deposits into this account have been my monthly transfers from my salary at Canton Savings and Trust. Richard, your contribution for the last half year has been exactly $0.00. My business is in a transition phase, Thea. You know that? Richard yelled, his face turning a darker shade of red. I'm working on a major consulting contract with a firm in Cleveland. When that comes through, you can pay your own bills, I interrupted, my voice remaining entirely steady. I flipped to the next page. This is the autodraft cancellation confirmation from Malone University. Hunter, your spring semester tuition of $14,800 is no longer pending on my account. The university has already processed the change. If the balance isn't paid by Friday at 5 p.m., a late fee of $500 will be applied, and your enrollment for the spring term will be suspended. Hunter looked at his father, his eyes wide with genuine panic. Dad, is that true? Tell me she's lying. Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the paper to me. He didn't answer his son. He couldn't. And finally, I said, sliding the last document toward Beatrice. This is the credit card statement for the secondary card on my account. The one Richard uses. I deactivated it this morning. Beatrice, since you are so deeply concerned about Hunter's education and his dignity, I have printed out a copy of the tuition bill along with the university's routing number. I'm sure a woman of your high society, standing, and family pride can write a check for $15,000 by Friday. After all, family comes first, doesn't it? Beatrice stared at the paper as if it were a poisonous spider. Her mouth opened, then closed, her face pale. She looked at Richard, then back at me, her smug composure completely shattered. I don't have that kind of liquid capital just sitting around. Thea, you know my trust is structured quarterly. This is absurd. You are his stepmother. No, Beatrice, I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. I am a bank officer. And in my lane, we don't extend credit to bad risks. Last night, Richard drew a very clear line in the sand. He told me to know my lane. He told me that Hunter is not my son, and that I have no right to discipline him, to correct him, or to have a say in how he behaves in my house. I accepted that. But what Richard forgot is that in my lane, the person who holds the pink slip owns the car. The person whose name is on the bank account owns the money. And the person who paid off this house 12 years before she ever met him owns the roof over your heads. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Richard stared at the stack of papers on the table. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by a cold, hollow look of realization. He looked like a man who had been playing a high-stakes game of poker with borrowed chips, only to realize the owner of the chips had just walked out of the room. Thea, Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, desperate plea. Please, we can't do this. We're a family. We can talk about this. Hunter will apologize. Hunter, tell her you're sorry. I'm sorry, Thea, Hunter stammered, his voice trembling. He looked at me, but I could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't sorry for how he had treated Chloe. He wasn't sorry for his arrogance. He was sorry that his car was gone, His allowance was gone, and his free ride was over. I looked at him, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of pity. Not because I wanted to help him, but because I realized how badly his father and his aunt had failed him. They had raised him to believe that respect was something you demanded, not something you earned. They had taught him that money was a shield that protected him from the consequences of his own cruelty. I appreciate the words, Hunter, I said quietly. But as I told your father this morning, a forced apology is like a bad check. It bounces the second you try to cash it. You aren't sorry. You're just cold. And unfortunately for you, the heat in this house is paid for by my salary, too. I stood up, picked up my briefcase, and latched it once more. The sound was like a gavel striking a desk, finalizing a verdict that could never be overturned. I'm going to my office to do some work, I said, looking at the three of them sitting around my mother's table. Richard, I suggest you and your sister figure out how you're going to pay for Hunter's tuition by Friday. Because as of this moment, my lane is closed to traffic. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them alone with the cold, hard math of their own making. The clock on my office wall ticked past 5 on Friday afternoon, and the silence that followed was absolute. At that exact moment, the Malone University Registrar's database automatically updated. I didn't need to log in to know what the screen looked like. Hunter's spring registration was suspended. His name systematically purged from the roster of sophomore classes. The university didn't care about his designer sneakers. And they certainly didn't care about his Aunt Beatrice's imaginary social standing. They cared about routing numbers. And when mine vanished, his education vanished with it. I packed my briefcase, turned off my desk lamp, and drove home in the pouring rain. When I pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Richard's car, a modest sedan he actually owned but rarely drove because it didn't fit his executive image, was parked near the garage. When I walked through the front door, the air inside felt cold, as if the furnace had given up trying to warm a house that had become a battlefield. I found Richard sitting in the dark of the den. The television was off. He had a legal pad in his lap, covered in frantic, scribbled numbers. Beatrice couldn't do it, he said, his voice sounding thin, stripped of the booming confidence he usually used to fill a room. She tried. But her grandfather's trust has a restriction clause. She can't draw against the principal for third-party educational expenses. She couldn't write the check. Thea, I know, I said, setting my keys on the console table. I've analyzed trust documents for 20 years, Richard. Most generational wealth is locked down tighter than a bank vault to protect it from people exactly like Beatrice. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow and dark. He's my son, Thea. He's 19. He doesn't know how the world works yet. You've ruined his life. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the small light above the stove, and filled the kettle with water. The humble, metallic sound of the water running into the kettle felt grounding. No, Richard, I said, looking at him through the doorway. I didn't ruin his life. I stopped subsidizing his ignorance. There's a very big difference. He's 19. That's old enough to draft into the army. It's old enough to punch a clock. If he doesn't know how the world works, it's because you raised him to believe that other people's labor would always pay for his luxury. I know some of you are listening to this right now. Perhaps sitting at your own kitchen table, wondering if I was too harsh. You might be thinking about your own children, or your own stepchildren, and how hard it is to draw a line that cuts that deep. I won't lie to you, it hurt. It felt like a heavy, cold stone sitting in the center of my chest. I had spent 3 years trying to build a family, trying to blend our lives into something solid. To watch it crumble into a pile of unpaid bills and bitter words was a failure, and I felt the weight of that failure in every bone of my body. But then I thought of Chloe. I thought of her standing on my porch in the autumn wind, crying because she felt like she messed up the dynamic just by existing. I thought of her teaching 20 toddlers how to be kind, driving her dented car, and never asking me for a single dollar because she had too much respect for my hard work to treat me like a resource. If protecting my daughter meant being the villain in Richard's story, then I was more than willing to wear the black hat. The next morning, I didn't wait for Richard to make his next move. I had already scheduled an appointment with Eleanor, a sharp, no-nonsense family law attorney whose office sat in a restored Victorian home near the county courthouse. Eleanor didn't waste time with hand-wringing or empty sympathy. She sat behind a desk piled high with leather-bound legal codes and looked at the documents I had prepared. "You've done my job for me, Thea," Eleanor said, flipping through the neat, chronological bank statements I had printed. "The house is entirely separate property. You purchased it 12 years before the marriage, paid the mortgage from a separate account. And we have the tracing documents to prove he never contributed a dime to the principal or the upkeep. The joint account was funded solely by your bank salary. In the state of Ohio, his claim to any marital equity here is virtually non-existent. And the car? I asked. The sedan is in your name as primary, she said, tapping the title copy. The OR registration means you had every right to take possession. We'll file a motion for temporary orders along with the divorce petition. He'll have 30 days to vacate the premises. Given his complete lack of income and the fact that you've been supporting him, he might try to ask for spousal support, but with his business history and the dissipation of marital assets we can prove through his emergency credit card use, a judge will laugh him out of court. I took a deep breath, the cool paper-scented air of the office filling my lungs. Let's file it today. The separation was not clean, and it was not quiet. When the process server arrived at my red brick house the following Tuesday, Richard lost what little dignity he had left. He screamed. He threw a heavy ceramic mug not at me, but against the kitchen wall, where it shattered into dozens of tiny, useless pieces, and he accused me of using my money to control him. I didn't scream back. I stood by the kitchen counter, my mother's chipped gravy boat sitting safely behind the cabinet glass, and watched him pack his clothes into black plastic lawn bags. Hunter didn't say a word to me. He packed his video game console, his designer pullovers, and his mountain of shoes into his father's trunk. He looked smaller than he had on Sunday night. The smug, triumphant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by the sullen, angry silence of a child who had finally realized that the world doesn't owe him a living. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of town, near the old steel mills. I know this because the address was listed on the legal documents Richard's attorney eventually sent back to Eleanor. It was a drafty, brick complex where the trains rumbled past twice a night, shaking the windows. It was a far cry from my quiet, tree-lined street in Canton. By December, the divorce was finalized. There was no grand courtroom battle, no dramatic speeches. Richard simply signed the papers because he couldn't afford the legal fees to fight me. He had spent his entire life pretending to be a successful consultant, but when the mask was stripped away, he was just a man with a bad credit score and a mountain of pride he couldn't cash at the bank. One Sunday evening in early April, the snow was finally starting to melt from the Ohio hills, leaving the ground wet and smelling of rich, dark earth. Chloe came over for dinner. We sat at my mother's oak table, the same table where Hunter had mocked her sweater just 6 months prior. The room smelled of chicken pot pie and cinnamon. Chloe was wearing a new sweater, a soft, forest green knit she had bought herself with her first small raise from the preschool. She looked beautiful. She looked happy. Her shoulders were relaxed, and she laughed without checking the room to see if she was allowed to be happy. "Mom," she said, leaning her chin on her hand as she watched the tea kettle whistle on the stove. "I ran into Hunter yesterday." I paused, my hand hovering over the cabinet door. "Oh, where?" "At the Giant Eagle on Strip Avenue," she said softly. "He was working there. In the dairy section. He was wearing an apron and stocking cartons of milk." I set 2 mugs down on the table. "How did he look?" "Tired," Chloe said, and there was no malice in her voice, only a quiet, gentle observation. "He didn't look at me at first. I think he was embarrassed, but then he saw me, and he nodded. He didn't say anything mean. He just asked if I was doing okay. I told him I was. He said he's taking classes at Stark State now, the community college. He's paying for them himself." I sat down across from her, my fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic of my mug. "I'm glad," I said quietly. And I meant it. I didn't want Hunter's life to be ruined. I didn't want him to spend the rest of his days bitter and broken in a drafty apartment. I wanted him to learn. I wanted him to realize that the only things that truly belong to you are the things you earn with your own hands. My relationship with Richard was dead, and the bridge back to that family was burned to ashes. But in the quiet aftermath of that fire, something new had started to grow. Hunter was finally learning the math that his father had never understood. He was learning that $1 is worth exactly 100 cents of honest sweat, and that respect is a currency you have to earn before you can spend it. I looked across the table at Chloe, her face illuminated by the warm light of the kitchen. "If you've stuck with me this far, through the bank statements, the tow trucks, and the cold, hard signatures, I want you to remember one thing. Quiet strength isn't about being loud. It's not about winning every argument or making sure your enemies are completely destroyed. It's about knowing exactly what your boundaries are, and having the courage to stand behind them when the storm comes. It's about protecting the people who deserve your love, and letting go of the ones who only want to use you as a line item in their budget. Love is a gift, not a transaction. And once you realize that, no one can ever take your peace away from you again.